So I would say to you that when there's economic stress, then it's blame the immigrants, even though their contributions are always overwhelmingly positive. I mean, even now, undocumented immigrants contribute 7 billion to Social Security, something that they don't get. 7 billion.
That was Dr. Bryan Warde, a professor of social welfare at Lehman College. And this is Epicenter NYC. We connect our communities to news, information, and each other. I'm your host, Amber Castillo. Over the past several months, Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump's claim that immigrants are taking Black jobs has stirred up a lot of emotions, ranging from anger to outright ridicule. The narrative hasn't only been a talking point in debates, it sparked conversations on social media and in communities across the country. And it taps into a larger, more complicated history of how race and labor are intertwined and how certain groups are often pitted against each other. But the idea of immigrants taking jobs isn't new. It's an old tactic used to create division. Today, we'll explore the history behind these narratives, looking at how racial and economic anxieties can be weaponized by political leaders. We'll look at the dangers of conflating different immigrant experiences and the consequences of using divisive language when talking about employment. The rhetoric around Black jobs isn't just misleading, it's harmful, and it distracts from the real issues affecting both Black Americans and immigrant communities. That's what the experts tell us. And to help us make sense of these issues, we're joined by Dr. Bryan Warde, a professor of social welfare at Lehman College. Before we jump in, a quick message from our team.
Hi, I'm Mariana from the Epicenter NYC team. Did you know that anxiety, sleep problems, and muscle pain could be symptoms of long COVID? Take the steps needed to protect yourself, your family, and your plants. Get vaccinated against COVID-19. We can help you schedule your appointment and even arrange you right there. Email us at hello@epicenter-nyc.com or call or text us at 917-818-2690.
Now back to the show. Here's my conversation with Dr. Warde.
So I would say to you that when there's economic stress, then it's blame the immigrants, even though their contributions are always overwhelmingly positive. I mean, even now, undocumented immigrants contribute 7 billion to Social Security, something that they don't get. 7 billion. It's employed here. Trump is unique in that he's employed it not just about employment, but he's tied immigration now to criminality. And immigration has been more tied to criminality and what we call border security since 9/11. 9/11 was a great game changer in how the immigrant was seen. And so the immigrant went from a threat to the job to a threat to border security. So that what he talks about was the rapist and the people who they're bringing in. This really wasn't about work. This was really more about they are a threat and they're a threat to an American way of life. And I think it's tied, even though he doesn't say, I think it's tied a lot to the change in the coloring of America, right? The notion that the Spanish-speaking diaspora are now the largest single group. And that's changed when you look at the other groups of people of color, if you want to use that term. That's changed the demographic in America. And there's been great anxiety around that. And so that is connected to that anxiety. These criminals, these hordes of people, these descriptors are used to say that we've got to close the border. So I think his is less about the economics and more about using it as this threat to the American way of life.
Would you say that even if there's not real, but maybe there's a perceived sense among folks that are being targeted with that rhetoric, even if there is a perception and not a reality that our economy is bad or that there are issues that has been successful, even if the data does show like, hey, when you did have this surge of, more newly arrived people in New York City, for instance, unemployment rates for Black and Hispanics, right? Because he also mentioned Hispanics, and that is actually lower than in other periods. So even when the reality doesn't reflect that, it can still be about perception or about seeing like a larger share of a certain demographic than maybe you're used to.
I think perception is everything. This is why it's been so successful. I would argue that Black Americans and immigrants, for the want of a better word, are not competing in the same place for the same kind of work. Immigrants, more typically, if you're talking about immigrants who work in agriculture, who work in lower economic sectors, they're working in areas in which I don't see the competition with Black people for work. Certainly not in agribusiness. I tried to think about it because then I said to myself, because he used the term Black jobs. What are Black jobs? I was tripping out on what does he mean exactly? But again, I think it's making sense of nonsense. He talks nonsense. Black jobs. I mean, I remember looking in the social media sphere and people were like, what's a Black job? Even that statement speaks a lot to a kind of willful ignorance about the reality on the ground. Again, it's really difficult to make a case for immigrants taking people's jobs.
Yeah, in cities like New York or in urban settings where some of the more typical jobs for that are easier for undocumented immigrants to find are what we're talking about, like Uber drivers, we're talking about
Construction, yeah.
care economy. I had heard that, even childcare is becoming so unaffordable, or, fewer options, or there's more demand than supply. There's also talk of folks wanting, like, oh, with the surge of, migrant women, they can take care of our kids for this low wage.
I don't know the numbers on that in terms of recently arrived migrants, but we do know that one of the things that the mayor has been trying to do in New York is to absorb them into the workplace, right? That there are positions for them, there are unfilled jobs. The other thing is after COVID, we were not able to necessarily fill jobs. People said, well, I'm not going back to doing that. And what we found is that the newly arrived migrants have kind of moved into those spaces.
So even with that in mind, you're saying that these aren't necessarily the jobs where you're going to see like the most like Black New Yorkers, for instance, going for, like, these are more likely to be undocumented or
sure.
asylum seeker.
For sure. For sure.
I'm wondering if there is an invisibility in some of this rhetoric for certain groups, and that you can't, and the intersections of that you can be Black and you can be an immigrant. And then kind of the distinction that politicians like Trump are making between Black jobs and Hispanic jobs, and then kind of othering immigrants. Yeah, if you have any thoughts about
that. I think that's an excellent point. I think that our language when we talk about immigrants is not precise. We use first the term immigrants. We don't talk about who we're talking about. Within the diaspora of immigrants, so if you're thinking about the Spanish-speaking diaspora, Honduras, you know, there are these countries that within them, there are Black people within them. How people tease themselves out. And to conflate immigrants and Black Americans and not make the distinction about who we're talking about, for me, becomes this kind of dangerous rhetoric. But I think he just throws it at the wall because it's just something at this point resonates with people. They need someone to blame, and immigrants are it.
Do you think that this kind of othering or this kind of rhetoric around, immigrants taking your jobs was historically very successful with the Irish immigrants who had been here longer than the newly arriving Chinese migrants?
Not just Chinese, but also later Southern and Eastern Europeans. That rhetoric moved on to the Mexicans. And then when they had this great wave of immigration between 1880 and 1920 that brought millions of people from Eastern and Southern Europe, that rhetoric comes up again. And the rhetoric is so strong, it's the basis for the Immigration Restriction League, and it's the basis for the 1924 Quota Act, which closes the door to Southern and Eastern European in favor of Northern European. And one of the things was about their inferiority, but also this notion that they're taking away jobs from good Americans.
Do you think that this kind of rhetoric could be as successful as some of those other, like they're taking away Irish jobs or all of that when you're talking about Black jobs?
For me, and I think this is a matter of, this could be debated. The focus has for me been less on jobs and more on these people are a threat to our way of life. There's a very sinister piece to it. It isn't just about jobs. You know what he's saying to do? I'm going to round up people and deport them. I want you to think about that for a moment. No other president in American history said anything like that. And Now, can he do it? What it would cost? The logistics are impossible for it to happen. But even the rhetoric is frightening. Let's be clear that that rhetoric, it appeals to people as they look around and they see their country changing.
Do you think that
And
that could appeal even to Black Americans?
for sure. Yeah, for sure. And I think he can appeal to established Black Americans and others. Again, I don't like the word Latino or Black, but for want
Yeah.
of a better word, like his Hispanic groups who have been established. Look, some of the biggest anti-immigrant rhetoric is not coming from white people necessarily. It's coming from other Latino groups who are more established. We came here the right way. You
Mm.
should hear some of the stuff I've heard from my students when it comes to the Venezuelan immigrants. I'm like, what? They themselves are DACA recipients. But it's always, if I'm here and somebody else is coming, they're going to take away the little that I have. I've heard people say things like, well, I never got these services. It isn't just white Americans. In fact, I think, as you quite rightly say, that can be same for anybody who's established here and feels a sense of what's going on here. Why are we using these resources for these people when our people need these resources?
That's interesting because some analyses of what's going on with the Trump campaign, but people behind the scenes on like Project 2025 and like the Christian nationalist movement and everything is that it's all about this anxiety among white Americans, that demographic anxiety. And, with that, like the loss of power and all of that. Do you think that there could be a case for that kind of stirring the pot with demographic anxiety with other groups, like
For
even with the
sure.
minorities, but if you were a larger minority and now a lower
For
minority or
sure.
share of that?
For
Yeah.
sure. And I mean that's pitting groups against each other as American as apple pie. It's not there's nothing about that's new. For example, this notion of who's white in America has undergone tremendous changes. Somebody who was Irish wasn't necessarily thought of as white. Somebody who's Jewish wasn't necessarily thought of as white. This is a more post-war phenomenon. I think people think about whiteness and who is acceptable as being fixed. It's not fixed, it's changed with power. I would argue that the kind of, what they call it, pigmentocracy that you see happening in the Spanish speaking diaspora could happen here in America. We've heard the story of Black Cubans and white Cubans and how their experiences are very different, very, very different. I've spoken to people from Honduras. I've spoken to people from El Salvador. I've spoken to people from the Dominican Republic. This notion that is one group and that there is not hierarchies within those groups and how those hierarchies allow people to integrate differently, how they see themselves in terms of the host country. There are people I know, for example, who could easily pass as white.
Definitely. And is part of the uniqueness with Trump also just his ability to get away with that or to appeal to even more Americans with this kind of rhetoric? Or no, would you say?
What's really great is that he speaks in a way that allows people's xenophobia and racism to seem legitimate.
And the desensitization of some of that, maybe that other
He
people.
says what other politicians may think but wouldn't dare to say. He says it. And then you have people who say, yes, those immigrants. And then he's aided by a news media that if, for example, who's a migrant does something, that's going to be front page news.
Yeah.
And let me just say that other people saw what he did and got wise to it. So DeSantis, right, jumped on that bandwagon. Haley, they kind of jumped on that bandwagon also.
Do you think that it's something unique about his personality or his brash way of speaking that allows him to get away with that? Or do you think it's something about this moment and about like some of that demographic and anxiety around power, especially among white Americans, that happens to overlap with
It's
Trump?
a great question. You could answer that question. I think you answered it. I think that this is a moment in time. I think he's a very unique person. Also, look at this in a broader global perspective. We are at a time of right-wing populism around the world. You can see where there was a snap poll in the French parliament and the right-wing Le Pen party, National Front party, got more seats than they could have imagined. Sweden, Denmark, all these places that were previously liberal, have all moved right around immigration. There is a world anxiety about what it means to be Swedish, what it means to be American.
And the global anxiety of this, or how this is happening, would you attribute some of that to like migration movements that are accelerating due to things like climate change or due to some of the economics? But yeah, what are some of those things you would attribute some of this like growing anxiety because of how the world is maybe migration is changing or groups are changing?
So it's a really, really great question. And my latest book, which is going to be published in the New Year, is around immigration. And the chapter I have I have a chapter on global immigration. Actually, immigration is statistically quite rare. It's statistically rare, even though I don't know, I'm the son of an immigrant, I'm an immigrant. Most immigration is economic, and it's in places like these oil-rich countries, Oman, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, where 80 to 90% of their working population are migrant laborers from places like the Philippines, Bangladesh, China. So that's the dominant immigrant story, and that's temporary. In fact, I would say to you, in America, Mexican immigration was transient. And labor did not settle here because
Right.
the borders were open. You know, it was only until they passed the 65 Immigration Act where they put quotas for each country, even though they opened up immigration. But if you're from the Dominican Republic, if you're from Mexico, if you're from the Caribbean, you could come to America freely from 1900. The numbers only became after they said, well, we're going to open up immigration to the rest of the world, and so we're going to put caps. But before those caps in 65, people could come to America freely from the Western Hemisphere.
What, like, especially yourself with your, social work background and just your experience, your expertise on all these, what are some steps or what are some like ways that we can counter some of these narratives? Like, what are some things we can say to others?
So I'm a big fan of putting things in historical context. This is not new. This is just an ongoing story. They said it about every immigrant group, unless you're white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. And yet the descendants of these people have made America what it is today. America hasn't disintegrated. It's grown and remains one of the dominant forces in world politics. So mine is always that immigration is never a bad thing. It is complex. It can be messy, but it's something that will enable or enables the country to grow and to be more dynamic and to absorb different ways of seeing the world and absorb that into making America a place that will continue to thrive because it's unique in its acceptance of immigrants. And I think that always strengthens, even though it comes with bumpy roads, it always strengthens the country. I would remind people to remember their immigrant experience.
This conversation is a part of Epicenter NYC's coverage of underrepresented communities and issues around the 2024 elections. To read more of our political stories or check out our election site, click the link in our show notes. And if you like this episode, please share it with friends or leave us a review. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting us as we do our best to support our community. We couldn't do it without you. For more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at epicenter-nyc.com. Our intro music is All the Pretty Horses by Karavika. You can find more of their music on their website, linked to in our podcast description.